Pep Guardiola's Manchester City have won the treble, but have they done it by breaking his own rule? Well, what do I mean by his own rule? Well, in this quote that I have in front of me from Sam Lee, who covers Manchester City for The Athletic, we can see a quote from Pep Guardiola this season saying, "When people say Pep wants to control the ball 90 minutes, yeah, it's what I'm working for every single day, to have 90 minutes control of the game, to score a lot of goals, concede few chances." Now, the important word for you to focus on here is control, and the big question becomes, what is it that Pep Guardiola means when he says control is so important? Well, let's have a look at the board here, because whenever we talk about Pep Guardiola's football, we tend to end up talking about positional play. Now, if you've watched any of our videos, you'll know that Pep Guardiola uses positional play to stretch an opposition backline to generate space that can be exploited in attacking phases, but then further back in the field, it's all about manipulating the opposition's pressing patterns. So what you're trying to do then is move them around so that you can move the ball through these different lines of pressure to get it into that final third to generate those chances. But there's actually another aspect of positional play that often gets overlooked, and that is how you can use its principles in order to control the ball in possession. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at the tactics board. So this is the Man City team from last season, and as we can see, there's no Erling Haaland. What we have instead are these two false nines. So we've got Foden and De Bruyne here. We've also got a double pivot and a flat back four as well for the most part. And this is how they would build up in their play. But most of the time, what they're trying to do is force the opposition into their own third, push all of their players forward like this. You end up with this kind of structure, with the opposition guarding their own box and Manchester City trying to break them down somehow to generate a goal. Now, if you're trying to break down a low block, what you're essentially trying to do is spread the opposition backline apart, generate space that can be exploited. And if you've got false nines, a really nice way of doing that is by having one of them dropping deep, pulling a centre back with them. And this leaves a little bit of space in behind the other false nine can get into. Now, with the false nine dropping out here, what we've actually done is we've built a really nice structure in this area of four players who can stay close together. They can retain possession of the ball. And if they can either find this pass through to the other false nine, or in certain situations, you might see this cross-field ball into Mahrez, who's isolated against a fullback here. You would now hope that he could get round that fullback and then play the ball across the box like this into, again, the false nine. But these attacking options are quite risky, because if you play the ball into a packed penalty area or play a cross-field ball into a 1v1 situation, there's always the opportunity for the opposition to pick the ball up and launch a counter-attack of their own. And this is where the control aspect of positional play comes in, because what we have here is actually a really nice unit to control a ball. They can move it around, they can evade opposition pressure, they'll probably have an overload in this area, and if the pressure becomes too much, then there's the option of being able to recycle it, because there should be a relay player just behind this unit able to pick the ball up if that pressure gets too much. Now, if you move it back here, you can play it back to the goalkeeper, you could play it through the middle and try and generate an attack there as well, or you can move it to the other side. And if it ends up on the other side, the nice thing about this structure is that it's symmetrical, so you can end up with exactly the same shape, albeit on the other side. So you can pull the other false nine back across, and now we've got this structure of four players here around the ball who can retain possession of the ball, withstand opposition pressure. They can attack from this side, albeit in a slightly different way. So you're still trying to get Mahrez in behind his fullback, and when he gets into this sort of area, he's going to play the crossfield ball, and you should have De Bruyne, Foden and Grealish all coming in trying to get on the end of it, trying to score. So the attacking ideas are quite different, but the shape remains the same, and importantly, you still have the option of taking the controlled route here as well. So you can play the ball around. If the pressure gets too much, then you have this relay player with the centre back here. You can play the ball back to him, retain possession, and then you're not worrying about these turnovers, which can result in really dangerous chances for the opposition. Now, if we fast forward to this season and look at the Manchester City starting 11, this actually looks quite different to what we saw at the beginning of last season. But actually, in those same sorts of situations where you're pushing the opposition back into their own third, we end up with a very, very similar structure, because we've got the two wide players here. Haaland is now a 9. We have the two 8s here. One of the back line is going to join Rodri as a pivot, usually John Stones more recently. So you've got your double pivot here again. You have a situational back three. And okay, this is a different structure, but we've still ended up with these units of four players on either side. And the big difference is that whereas last season we had two relay players behind each one of these units, we now actually only have the one, and we push the other one into a position as a striker. But the general principles are still there. You can still retain possession of the ball in these wide areas. You have the option of playing the ball through now into Erling Haaland, who's one of the most dangerous goal scorers in the history of the world. And we also have this relay player at the back here who can retain possession and move it to the other side, move it through the middle if you need to. But this new structure has actually made Pep Guardiola reassess his ideas about control, because these sorts of passes into the box have to be weighed up as to whether or not they're going to result in a goal or a turnover. Now, previously, without Haaland in the box, you're using false nines in these sorts of areas, so the passes into the box are much less likely to result in goals. But when you put Erling Haaland there, suddenly this pass becomes much more likely to result in a goal, and therefore much less likely to result in a turnover. And so this has made Pep Guardiola realise that he can let go of elements of control because the result is going to be more goals. And so the story of this season has been Manchester City trying to be more direct, trying to find Erling Haaland in these dangerous goal-scoring situations. So here's another quote from Pep Guardiola. Many times in the beginning, when Haaland made movements between the central defenders, we didn't pass the ball because we were not used to those type of balls in the past. One game I remember 10 or 25 clips and we said, look at Erling, the movements he has. And everyone said, if you give him the ball, he is in front of goal. Why did you not give it to him? That's why in the start, everyone said it was going to be difficult to adapt. And in the end, we found him more. And so that's the story of the season in a nutshell for Pep Guardiola, trying to get Erling Haaland into these dangerous situations through more direct play. So I want to give you just a few examples of what this looked like on the pitch. So on the board in front of me, this is the lineups from the FA Cup game between Manchester City and Arsenal that Manchester City won 1-0. Now you may think this is a bit of a weird game to focus on, but this was actually the first of 3 games that Arsenal played against Manchester City, and the other 2 were Premier League games. So I think that Mikel Arteta was just trying something quite experimental, and that experimental thing was going really aggressive out of possession. So let's just imagine that Manchester City are going to try and build up from the back here, and Arsenal are going to be really aggressive in a high press. So they're going to push their front 3 onto the back 3 of Manchester City. The 2-8s are going to sit on the double pivot of Manchester City. And then we're going to end up with the fullbacks on either side, tight on the wide players. But we're going to see a little bit more flexibility in this area of the pitch because despite the fact that Arsenal are going to try and have 2 players on Erling Haaland all the time, they're also wanting to go man to man across the pitch. And that's going to mean that there's going to be a little bit of flexibility here. So if the ball comes across to this side of the field, Partey is going to go to the ball-sided number 8, which is Gundogan in this situation. And Arsenal are going to make sure that the other number 8 isn't free. So in this instance, Gabriel might come across to Kevin De Bruyne. And then what you're doing is you're leaving Haaland in a 1v1 against Holding in this situation. And then on the other side, if the ball comes in here, Partey will come across to De Bruyne, Holding will push up onto Gundogan, and now you've got that isolation between Gabriel and Haaland as well. And so what you're ending up with is Arsenal 1v1 across the whole pitch against Manchester City and leaving Haaland very much exposed against one of the centre-backs, which is a really risky thing to do. And the result of that was that Manchester City were really happy going long from the goalkeeper, trying to get the ball into those situations where the isolation was occurring. So this is Stefan Ortega's passes against Arsenal in that game, and as you can see, there's plenty of passes into this area in particular, which is where Rob Holding was. So Pep Guardiola is clearly happy for his goalkeeper to hit these long balls because 2 things can happen. Either Erling Haaland is going to win that duel and he's going to go through and score. The other thing that could happen is that Manchester City could lose the ball, but then Arsenal still have to try and get through the whole of the Manchester City team to try and make that into a dangerous situation. And so once again, this is all about managing risk, weighing up pros and cons, and making decisions that will actually result in more goals. But that doesn't mean to say that Pep Guardiola always wants his team to go long, because there are more and less controlled ways of being direct. So I've got another clip here from a different game against Arsenal, this time in the league. This was a game that Manchester City ended up winning 4-1, and the first goal that was scored in this game was one that was scored quite directly, but it was one that Pep Guardiola wasn't that happy with. So again, here's Manchester City in a build-up phase. Arsenal are going really aggressive. They're going to try and cause problems for City and turn the ball over, and Ederson here is going to pass the ball to John Stones. Now John Stones is clearly looking the wrong way. He's facing back to his own goal, and he should be facing the other way, and so Ederson probably shouldn't play this pass. And the result of that is that by the time John Stones is able to play the ball, you can see that Arsenal are all around the ball here, making it much harder for City to get the ball down the field. And in the end, all that John Stones can do is play the ball long, even if Gundogan does think that John Stones has the ability to play this really nice pass into the penalty area. But in the end, John Stones goes long, and we can see it comes down to the feet of Erling Haaland. This is not a great situation for Man City because, as you can see, there's an overload here. There's 5 Arsenal players, 3 Manchester City players. But actually, this is Kevin De Bruyne, this is Erling Haaland, this is Jack Grealish. These are some of the best players in the world. And what results from this is that Erling Haaland plays the ball to Kevin De Bruyne. Kevin De Bruyne runs through all of the Arsenal players, takes a shot from here and scores. Now, this is obviously a very low value chance, but because Manchester City have this talent, they are able to turn these sorts of outside chances into goals. But the thing is that in this situation, Pep Guardiola is not particularly happy. Immediately in the aftermath, the celebrations, you can see him gesticulating with Ederson, asking him why he played that risky pass into John Stones, because that is not the sort of control that Pep Guardiola wants. So despite the fact that he wants his team to be more direct and get the ball into the feet of Erling Haaland, this doesn't mean to say that he's got rid of the idea of control altogether. He wants direct attacks, but with control. And we've got a really nice example of this from the same game. So this is in the 25th minute, and we're in the same sort of situation situation, Manchester City trying to build up from the back, and again, Arsenal being really aggressive in their press. Now in this situation, rather than playing the ball long, what we're going to see is Manchester City actually attempt to move the ball through the lines of pressure that Arsenal are throwing at them. And what is going to happen here is we're going to see a number of third-man combinations. Now a third-man combination is simply a pass which goes to another player via a third player. So in this instance, we're going to see John Stones play the ball into this area, and he's actually going to find Bernardo Silva, as we can see here. And Bernardo Silva is going to play an immediate pass into the feet of Kyle Walker, who's going to do a third-man combination into this area here. So what's happened is that Manchester City have moved the ball through the different lines of pressure. The ball actually ends up with Erling Haaland, and because Manchester City have done such a good job of baiting Arsenal forward with the press, there's a huge amount of space for them to attack. So we can see here Kevin De Bruyne running into the space, and Erling Haaland is able to play that pass, and Kevin De Bruyne is through on goal. And so what we have here is build up in the same way. You're generating these dangerous transitional moments, but you're doing it in a much more controlled manner. But not only does this more direct way of playing actually help you in an attacking sense, it can also help you in a defensive sense as well. And we saw really good examples of that against Real Madrid in the second leg of the Champions League semi-final. So we've got Manchester City here in their defensive shape. They defend in a 4-4-2 shape. And you can see in this instance, they've just turned the ball over. Now, what they're going to try and do here is they're going to try and attack Real Madrid. As you can see here, the aggregate is 3-1 to them. So there's no pressure for them to score. But what they do want to do is move the ball as far away from their goal as possible without compromising their defensive structure. So what we're going to see is John Stones here on the ball. He's going to play the ball immediately here to Bernardo Silva, and Bernardo Silva is going to flick the ball to Kevin De Bruyne. So that pass is played. You can see the flick through the legs from Bernardo Silva here. And what I've done here is I've drawn a line just to show you how compact Manchester City are in their own third here. There's only Kevin De Bruyne and Erling Haaland who are ahead of Jack Grealish here. And what we're going to see is it's just going to be these two players who commit forward for the attack, which means that they've got all of these players back to defend should the ball be turned over. So if we move the play on, we can see here's Kevin De Bruyne. He's in behind Camavinga here. We can see Erling Haaland making this dangerous run in behind the defensive line, and Kevin De Bruyne just has to play this pass through to find him. And as we can see, the rest of Manchester City aren't even in the Real Madrid half. You can see here Bernardo Silva just about to cross the halfway line. But the idea here is that you can still do these really dangerous transitional plays without compromising your defensive shape as well. When you have players like Kevin De Bruyne and Erling Haaland, these sorts of situations become much more dangerous. And so what we've learned about Pep Guardiola this season is that his rules about control are much more flexible than we thought, and those rules are based on an assessment of the players at his disposal. So one final quote here from Guardiola. He says, "We have Kevin De Bruyne, we have Jack Grealish, we have Erling Haaland especially, and Julian Alvarez, and they can run definitely, and I love it, I like it." At the end of the day though, it is just regain the ball and run. How do you train that? Okay, run. It's the quality of the players that is most important here. So this quote makes it very clear that Pep Guardiola assesses his ideas of control on the basis of the players at his disposal. And so his ideas about control are actually much less rigid than we thought. This is about risk management, and if the payoff is more goals, then he's happy to sacrifice this idea of absolute control.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.